And so let's dig and delve a little bit into Ruth chapter 2. Now, there's so much here, you could do a whole series just on one chapter. But I'm sure that you remember that last week we left Naomi and Ruth in Bethlehem. They just arrived back from Moab, and the tone was one of sadness and bitterness. Naomi had said, "Call me Mara," which means bitter. But it was harvest time, and harvest is a time of hope and a time of promise. El Shaddai, God, and El Shaddai can be translated as God who is sufficient, was about to show why he is so named. But if you were looking at the situation through Naomi and Ruth's eyes, well, things didn't really look that way. Now, there's an American writer called Alyssa de los Santos who describes herself as a Jesus lover, a storyteller, a hope hunter and a ragamuffin. And she also writes for A Moment to Breathe, which is a set of daily readings, 365 devotions that meet you in your everyday mess, which I highly recommend. On May the 6th this year, she wrote these words: "I come by doubt honestly. When words don't align with what my eyes can see, skepticism leads me to discount the likelihood altogether. But faith is the assurance of things I cannot see," from Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1. "When I rely on my nearsightedness, the details I can see leave me swallowed in doubt and paralysed by fear. Things won't always add up. Circumstances won't always make sense. But my confidence is in my Father, whose eyes see me when I can't see him, and who is assuredly working in ways I cannot see." Now, I'm sure we would forgive Naomi and Ruth any doubts, any fear that they might have had about God's ability to provide as they pondered their possible future. Their nearsightedness would have limited their long-term vision, of course. They were two widows, and one of them was a foreigner, no less. They had no means of support. They were struggling to survive. And the name El Shaddai didn't really fit with what their eyes could see. But it's within this understanding of God as El Shaddai that Naomi places her pain. She gives it over to God. And how wonderful it is when we can do that and receive God's blessing, God's grace in return. So this story is set to be full of suspense. What's going to happen next? But then the author immediately drops a plot spoiler and introduces us to Boaz. Now, two things are important to know about Boaz. Firstly, he was a kinsman, he was a relative on Naomi's husband's side. And the crucial importance of Boaz's family link will become clear later. But please note that in Israel the word family had a much wider meaning than it does today. Some Bible translations use the word clan, which gives us a better idea of the all-inclusive nature of the Old Testament family. Now, on my mum's side, I belong to a very large family. Once when we had a gathering quite a few years ago, there were 200 of us there. So maybe you get the idea that it was something more akin to that, as they thought about relationships within the clan, within the family, in ancient Israel. So, firstly, Boaz was related to Naomi. And secondly, Boaz was a man of wealth. Now, that phrase, a man of wealth, can be translated as valiant, virtuous, a man of substance, integrity, influence, and means. So there's lots of promise here. And this is very important for us to know as the readers of this story, as they are the reasons why Boaz will fulfill his role as this story moves to its conclusion. So let's move on with the story. Now, Ruth, by chance, or was it God's providence, God's grace at work here, found herself gleaning in Boaz's field. Now, sometimes we speak critically of all the rules and regulations in the Old Testament. Oh, there's one for every day of the year, thou shalt not, and all that. But those rules are there for a purpose. And the law regarding gleaning was a wonderful one if you happen to be poor, a foreigner, or a widow, or all three, as in Ruth's case, and you were trying to eke out a living. Now, feel free to read Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 to 10, which instructs the farmer who is harvesting the crop to not reap to the edges of the field, or go back to pick up any stalks of grain that may have been dropped, or grapes that may have been missed. I remember when we were hay timing on the farm, we would get all the hay in, and then the machine would be taken back into the field to scrape up, to make sure that none of the grass had been missed and that had been made into hay, and every last bale that was possible was got out of that field. But in ancient Israel, they weren't allowed to do that. Anything that was missed, anything that was left, had to be left behind. And they were left behind specifically so that anyone who was poor, anyone who was a foreigner, a sojourner, if you read the King James Version, living in this country, would be able to survive. They could help themselves to it. You see, God is a God who rescues. God is a God who cares for the poor, for the helpless and the needy. So the laws of the land should reflect God's nature and provide for these people. And God's laws did reflect his nature and provided for those who had nothing. Now, an ancient rabbi once asked his pupils how they could tell when the night had ended and the day was on its way back. Could it be, asked one student, when you see an animal in the distance and you can tell whether it's a sheep or a dog? No, answered the rabbi. Could it be then, asked another, when you look at a tree in the distance and can tell whether it's a fig tree or a peach tree? No, said the rabbi. Well then, what is it? His pupils demanded. It's when you look on the face of any woman or man and see that she or he is your sister or your brother. Because if you cannot do this, then no matter what time it is still night. Any country which claims to be Christian today, to have its constitution, its laws based on a Judeo-Christian tradition, should also make sure that those laws reflect God's concern for those on the edge of society. Laws should provide for the underprivileged, both at home and overseas. And they should show a just concern for an equal distribution, a just distribution of the earth's resources. And our laws should reflect God's nature. Because any government which turns its back on the poor, any government which turns its back on the foreigner, is walking away from God and will suffer the consequences. Now feel free to discuss that point. Because I would say, from reading my Bible, that providing for others, whoever they may be, is a mark of blessing and of grace, just as God made sure that his laws provided a blessing for those who had nothing because of his grace. Now, if a landowner didn't want to obey God's law, then they could make life difficult for the one who was gleaning in their field. The poor and the foreigner were dependent on the goodwill of the owner. And so Naomi says to Ruth at the end of the day, "Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Naomi, it's like her eyes were opened and she began to recognize a bigger picture. A bigger picture was opening up for her and for Ruth. And it was all down to Ruth's choice of field and the gracious nature of Boaz. Or maybe we can see God's hand at work, God's grace at work in the background. God busy at work in and through the decisions that were made and the nature of the people involved. I wonder what you think about that one. Boaz knew all about Ruth's kindness to Naomi, and when she asked, "Why are you being so good to me, a foreigner?" he told her it was because of all that she had done for her mother-in-law. And so he placed her under his protection. She was to keep close to the young women, to his young women. He ordered the young men not to bother her, and if she got thirsty she could drink from the water vessels that the young men had drawn. Excuse me. And there's more, of course. There's always more with God. Boaz blessed Ruth. And he said, "May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Now, we could speak for a long time about the symbolism of God's wings in the Old Testament, but perhaps we better save that for a future day. Now, after proclaiming this wonderful blessing over Ruth, Boaz wasted absolutely no time in beginning to make the blessing into a reality. He invited her to share his lunch, bread and sour wine. He ordered his men to make sure that they left extra stalks of grain for Ruth to pick up, even to pull some out of the sheaves to leave on the ground, especially for her. So at the end of the day, she had lots of grain, an ephah or an ephah, which is apparently about 5 gallons of grain. So she did well to carry it all home to Naomi. But there was grace and blessing for all. Ancient Israel is a long way from our time and our culture. But there are lessons that we should learn from this part of Ruth's story, apart from the laws that the government should have in place. Both Boaz and Ruth show their faith by caring. Often we are very short-sighted and cannot see God's bigger picture. Life can be challenging and sometimes downright awful. But be assured that God will work through you and through others when you are open to him. And he will bless you. And his grace is always there. And we are called to reflect God's graciousness by blessing others. And this, of course, includes the poor and the foreigner. God's grace is defined by Paul in 2 Corinthians in this way: "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich." Chapter 8, verse 9. God wants our lives and our relationships to reflect his life and his relationships. Wherever we find ourselves and in whatever situation, the question we must ask is, how can I best show God's character, God's grace and love in Jesus right here, right now? Chapter 1 of Ruth ended with reference to the harvest, even though the tone was one of sadness, of bitterness, and of poverty. Chapter 2 also closes with reference to the harvest, but now the situation has changed. The tone is one of comfort, of grace, and of blessing. A bigger picture has opened up in the light and the wonder of God's blessing and God's grace. Amen. And it is in this God of blessing, this God of grace, this God who provides us with hope, that we can sing of him in our next hymn, which is 882, Lord of all hopefulness. Or of course there's always number 31 in Mission Praise, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound.